You are the productive academic worker and you're well, and then that means that you get to achieve, right? You get to be successful. It's the ones who aren't well, who aren't enough, who don't do the right things, the ones who are deviant or distant from that normative ideal. Of course, they're failing. They don't fit in anyway.
Welcome to Unlivable Cultures. Unlivable Cultures is a podcast making with and borrowing from anthropology, social theory, and other forms of knowledge for a more livable world. Today, I'm here with Dr. Margaret Price and Dr. Mimi Cook, who both have recent releases of their books from Duke University Press. Dr. Price has Crip, Spacetime, Access, Failure, and Accountability in Academic Life, and Dr. Mimi Cook has Dear Elia, Letters from the Asian American Abyss, which also, I might add, won the Duke University Press Scholars of Color First Book Award. So congratulations for that.
Woo!
I'm really honored to have this conversation with both of you and be able to have a dialogue about the books and allow the, books to kind of have a dialogue with each other through you. It's kind of been a really cool idea that I've never been able to do, is like have authors talk about their books together and how they might cross over. So this is a really exciting conversation.
Together is always more fun.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. My name is Clayton Gerard. I use he, him pronouns. And as an image description, I have pale white skin, brown hair, and I'm wearing a white shirt with a black hooded jacket. And the background behind me is blurred on Zoom, but I have a window that's pretty bright. And I will pass it to Mimi if you're willing to provide a little introduction about yourself.
Sure, yeah. I'm Mimi Cook. I use she, her pronouns. Identify as Vietnamese American, Asian American. On your screen, but not the listener's screen, I am have light olive skin, short black hair, and I am sitting in front of a virtual background of a bakery, which is my favorite background. I became a baker in the pandemic, so I pretend that this is the bakery I would have had. And if I had another career that actually paid money.
I love that. And a little callback to your essay from Crip authorship, where you talk about writing and baking. So a little plug for that.
Yes.
Margaret, I'll pass it to you.
Yes. I'm Margaret Price. I am an associate professor at Ohio State University. And right now I'm in my office at school with my dog, Otis, who is not feeling good at all because we're having a day with thunder and rain. I'm a white person with gray hair. I'm genderqueer and use she, her pronouns. And I'm trying to remember if there's anything else I should have mentioned. I will say that in addition to Otis, I have a tiny, very old Chihuahua and a very opinionated calico cat.
I love that. Yeah, I'm so excited to be talking with both of you about your amazing books. Just to give listeners a little intro into the kind of work that you do and the kind of interventions you're making, would you be willing to share a little bit about your books and what kind of topics that you cover or questions that you share and maybe possibly answer?
This is Margaret speaking. I should say right at the get-go that Crip Spacetime, a lot of it is inspired by Mimi's work. Mimi was kind enough to keynote one of the meetings of the Society for Disability Studies conference that was organized here at Ohio State. And she had an electrifying effect on the audience and spoke in that keynote in part about what it means to be unwell in academic space. And I was already pretty far along on the data collection and analysis for Crip Spacetime. The book project as a whole was 12 years. So that was smack in the middle of it. 2018 was like 6 years in. And I was just so heartened by learning what it meant to just be so straightforward about unwellness and say, this is not okay. I think that before then, I had been taking a little bit more of a maybe like conciliatory attitude, like everybody's doing their best,
Mm,
accommodation's not so bad sometimes. And partly as a result of Mimi's influence, I began to see my data in a new light and say accommodation is just harmful. Like institutional approaches to access are just harmful. They're not a system that we can fix. They're like I don't know, square tires on a bike. Like we need a different model altogether. So Crip Spacetime, that's its big argument, is efforts at so-called access, however well meant, typically create more harm. They're not leading us in a good or a justice-oriented direction and just kind of not getting all the way there. And I think that's the common impression of the accommodations model is, well, it's imperfect, but it gets us part of the way there. What I found through analyzing the survey and interviews in Crip Spacetime is no, actually, that effort to fix on an individual basis and to just make people more fit for the competitive and
hmm.
unwell atmosphere of academia is going in the wrong direction altogether. We don't want to fix that system. We want something else. And that really ended up being the big argument of the book.
This is Mimi speaking. Margaret, thank you so much. I'm so honored. I want to call back to that conference as well. Um, as Margaret mentioned, my work is on unwellness, and the approach that I've tried to develop over the years is what I call a pedagogy of unwellness, or starting from the point of recognizing and admitting that we are all actually unwell in different ways. And I remember speaking at the conference that Margaret hosted and being welcomed into a disability studies, disability justice community that maybe didn't use that language of unwellness at the time, but clearly recognized it and had built such amazing structures of care. And that really helped me think about what it means to admit you're unwell, and then what does it mean to then find things or build things to tend to that unwellness. And it became very clear that it has to be collective. It has to be collective care to address what actually is collective unwellness. And so the book, Dear Elia is my daughter, um, is an attempt to do some of the similar work that Margaret is talking about uh, through the field and lens of mental health. So actually, I I agree that mental health actually is like accommodations in that it's doing the wrong thing as well, because it works from a model of like accommodations, individual pathology. An individual person, something's wrong with them, and then we fix them. And what are we fixing them towards? And when I asked that question, it became clear that we were fixing them towards a normative kind of idealized person, which is ableism, right? That's how ableism works. And so, how can we rethink mental health as actually tending to what hurts? That's the question of the book, what hurts, and how do we go on living while it hurts? That doesn't try to erase the ways that we are unwell to then try to make us into like perfect, productive citizens contributing to capitalist society. And so the book is a series of letters. It's genre bending. It's kind of a weird artsy workbook. It does scholarship, but also it has like fill in the blank, cool activities, has tarot cards, and it is asks the reader to kind of come along this journey of looking at Asian American mental health in particular, but come along to examine their own unwellness as they are engaging the unwellness of Asian Americans.
Yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning that and how the book focuses on Asian American wellness and unwellness. Like you mentioned, as a white person, I haven't heard those kinds of or been party to those conversations very often. So that aspect of your book was very illuminating, and how you kind of genre bend a little bit with the format of letters and the kind of exercises where the reader is then asked to reflect on certain things. I'll admit it took me by surprise in the beginning because I was like, oh, I was just reading this. I didn't want to have to do work. But it
Did you
was
do the activities? Did you do any of
some
them?
of them I did. Some of them I
Yay!
was like laying in bed when I was reading, and it's like 11:30 at night, and I was like, I don't know that I can turn the lights on and everything else. But yeah, the reflection exercises were really provocative and helpful to reflect on a lot of the topics that you were thinking through and writing about. So I just wanted to call that out and say how I appreciated that different format to this quote unquote academic book, since it's from an academic publisher, but you make very clear it's not really an academic book. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. I'm so curious about who's willing to do the activities, and also kind of the affective response, right? Like you were saying, you were caught by surprise that the book was actually asking you to do something
Mhm.
and engage activities that are actually challenging. Mental health work isn't just like bubble baths and feel good, right? That's part of what I'm arguing. It's actually doing some really hard emotional labor that I hope the book tries to model. And of course, I'm not grading you, so if you don't do the activities, it's totally fine. But I hope that they actually help open up a different kind of language and experience.
One thing, this is Margaret speaking. One thing I really love about books that have interactive activities, but don't imply that you must complete them in a certain order in order to get the good out of the book, is that I can feel invited to kind of dip in and dip out. So I've been reading a preprint of the book to write a review of Mimi's book. And I mean, I'm biased because I also know Mimi as an educator. So I can sort of hear Mimi's voice saying, like, you can try this, you can try that, see what this might be like. And it helps me feel, because I also tend to feel a little resistant when I feel like a book is giving me quote unquote homework. Um, and it helps me feel more invited in to just sort of make what I will of a particular exercise.
Yeah, there's no failing. There's no failing in the book. It's all A's, all A's.
Yeah, I love that. This is Clayton. Yeah, part of like being almost a bad student or a bad scholar, not
Yes.
having to worry about failing. But yeah, and just to mention that the questions and prompts that you provide are actually, like I said, like thought provoking. Sometimes books will have like discussion questions and such that are a bit of an eye roll, but this actually, was a bit of a challenge and had me to sit there and think through some things that were at some points a little uncomfortable and a little bit like, I don't know if I want to feel these things, but good to kind of
Mm.
process nonetheless.
One of my reviewers in the peer review process actually was like, I couldn't do some of them. It was too hard. Like I started crying and I had to put it down. And I could not deal with my own attachment to productivity at that moment. So that I am very thankful for both of you kind of being vulnerable about your experience of engaging these activities, that they feel hard, but also that, like Margaret said, I'm glad that they feel welcoming as well.
This is Margaret speaking again. It's striking to me, Mimi, that you say your reviewers said that they cried. I had similar reactions from the books, the reviewers from Duke University Press.
Mhm.
One reviewer just said briefly that it was emotionally difficult to get through, and the other reviewer, who gave much more of kind of a moment by moment account of their experiences they were reading.
Wow.
Yeah, that was literally one of the best reviews I've ever gotten. It was like a kind of movie of what this person was thinking as they went along. And I think they got about halfway through the book and their notes said, I am exhausted. I'm so sad. I'm so
Mm.
angry. I'm going to take a break. And in addition to like just being incredibly honored that reviewers were willing to push through that how difficult the material was, it reminded me how difficult the material is. Once I had gotten a few years past interviews, like I cried in interviews, interviewees cried in interviews. One of the research assistants that I worked with, we cried together over just the sort of sheer
Mm.
injustice and pain in many of these stories. But by the time the manuscript was coming together, I had gotten several years, it was several years after those more immediate visceral reactions. And I was reminded, this is so painful. Like, and this is another real resonance I see with Mimi's work, is not trying to solve pain or cure pain, but say, what does it mean to dwell um, collectively in pain, to understand that we're collectively in pain, and that's not great, but it is collective. It's not something we need to think is happening to us alone. It's not something that you need to necessarily run from as fast as you can, because that too is a community experience.
Mm-hmm.
This is Mimi speaking. Margaret, as you were speaking, it made me think about the work of witness that your book does, right? We say like studies and interviews and data, and that sounds very removed sometimes, right, from human experience and emotions. But what you are able to capture, what you're capturing, why it moved the reader so much, why you and assistants, research assistants, and um, interviewees were so moved is because you were making the space, right, to witness deep pain and deep harm. And that is hard work. And that is work a lot of people, I think, like you say, run away from or shy from, because looking at unwellness directly, one, is hard. Um, just looking at somebody else's pain is hard. But then having to think about your relationship to that pain is also really hard. And then having to then think about, well, what do I actually need? How do we actually think about community needs and do the work to build it? And that's also really hard. Um, and we are trained to think about, like you were saying, cure, right? We're trained to think that wellness is the normal and then we can fix everything and just be well again. And so it should be an easy solution individually to fix individual problems, even though that doesn't work. But we still believe it. We invest in it, maybe because it feels more doable, even as
Mm-hmm.
it punishes us as we're doing it. Maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, this is Clayton speaking. That's really powerful and, just generative to sit with. And as we're starting this conversation, I was wondering, to kind of ground listeners in the topics that we're talking about, if we could kind of expand a little bit on some of the words that both of your books really meditate on and deliberate with as we're talking about these different, I don't know what I'm saying, topics, whatever. Um, but like some of
Stuff.
these words, yeah,
Technical word
stuff,
is stuff.
right? Some of these words is like disability. What does that mean? Or ableism and Crip and unwellness. That's a really big term that you use, Mimi. So I was wondering if
Mhm.
maybe Margaret, you might be able to start with this one. What do like Crip and disability mean for how you're working with it, and just like in these scholarly conversations more generally?
Yeah, and thank you. That's a really important area to spend some time with. I often, I think, forget that I'm taking for granted terms that I use all the time, or that I use in community, and it's so important to say what I mean by those, and sort of how they're operationalized, and also often not agreed upon within communities. So, disability to me, I use it in the way that it's used in critical disability studies. So, typically in critical disability studies, we don't think of a disability as being identical to a diagnosis or an illness. We tend to think of it as a marker that's put on usually a body, but sometimes an object, to signal that that body or object is not meeting normative standards. So, in the view of disability studies, and particularly the more recent critical approach to disability studies, which kind of tries to get away from individual bodies altogether, disability is a concept that helps put into operation regimes of normality. So it enables us to do things like pay some people less money, assume that some people are unfit to do certain things, and then other people are fit to do those same things. It allows us basically to sort in ways that calling back to what Mimi was just saying about quick fixes, this sorting process can be very comforting because it allows us to think that we have people all figured out. Like the disabled people are over here and they can't do stuff. And then the abled people are over there and they can do stuff. But disability, as it's understood in most disability communities I'm a part of, is a much more shape-shifting kind of identity. It also tends to be a self-consciously minoritized identity. That is, it's a label people will claim to signal membership in a minoritized group, but it will not necessarily be used to signal any exact thing that's happening with your body mind. So Simi Linton, in her book Claiming Disability, has a really helpful explanation of this. It's a relatively old book. It was published, I think, around 25 years ago. But in it, Linton explains disability is at least as much a marker that people form community around as it is a marker of what's wrong with someone. So in some domains, we might say disability to signal there's something wrong with that person or animal or object. There's need of a fix, there's need of a cure. Also, I can make value judgments based on this label. But then in other domains, disability marks an affinity, a culture, an art making practice, the way that we find each other as members of a minoritized group. Now, I'm going to add a very quick aside, which is there's a few different ways of using the term. One could say, I have disabilities, or I have a disability. One could say, I am disabled. One could say, I am a person with a disability. I'm not going to go into that at great length, except to say that pretty much everyone I know just says, use the phrasing that works best for you and respect other people's phrasing. Now, Crip operates a little bit differently. And I would say is opinions about the term Crip are more divided in disability community. In my point of view, Crip signals a radical departure from the concept of disability as having something wrong with you. So it's discarding not only the medicalized idea that disability is a flaw or a problem, but it's discarding the term altogether and saying this reclaimed term Crip is showing that the way we're forming community is just moving beyond medicalized terms altogether. But there are a lot of issues with the use of this term. For example, there's a recent discussion, a really important discussion, in which some people are concerned that the term Crip is kind of an elitist academic term. It's used largely by sort of high-profile academics who just want to talk about theory and kind of dig each other and not really do substantive social change work, perhaps especially as it regards certain kinds of disabilities. So one of the concerns about the term Crip is it including many ways of being disabled? Is it including intellectual disability? Is it including developmental disability? And I don't have a good answer to those questions. I think they're really important to keep in front of us and to keep talking about.
That was really lovely, Margaret. This is Mimi speaking. I'll just add a little bit on ableism, since Clayton, you brought that term up. I teach interdisciplinary studies at Georgetown sometimes, and what I often teach my students is that ableism is not just discrimination against disabled people, right? That's what people tend to come into my classes thinking it is. Just like people think racism with a capital R is just discrimination against people of color. It's not just discrimination, it includes that, but so much of it is grounded in imagining a normative body and mind, right? There exists supposedly some ideal personhood that we all have to measure ourselves against. And if you don't meet that, then something is wrong with you. And then the goal of, medicine, therapeutic approaches is to get you to reach that idealized state. And when I say that, students then suddenly who don't identify as disabled, right? Don't use the word disability or disabled, don't use the word crip, or unfamiliar with the kind of not only theoretical frameworks, but also community, right? Identity terms, suddenly realize, oh, I have a relationship to ableism, right? There are ways in which I fail at being the right kind of body and mind all the time, right? We are always failing because that's an ideal, right? It's not something that people actually are able to reach. And then students can really see where ableism shows up in their lives, which is everywhere, especially in the university. The university holds up an ideal person all the time for students, for faculty, right? And so that way, ableism becomes much more textured, uh, and they can see themselves being harmed by it as well, even if they don't identify as disabled. I will add that I use the term unwell. I've been asked before, why do you use the term unwell? Why not illness? And I have no problem with the word illness. I identify as ill, unwell or ill. That's fine with me. But I found that the word illness comes with some baggage. People tend to use it when talking about medical diagnoses, right? And so something is an illness if there's a medical authority that says it is so. And the medical framework, like I mentioned before, is one of individual pathology. And so that baggage comes along with illness. And so when we say illness, people start thinking like for mental health, the DSM, right? The Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, um, particular diagnoses that psychiatrists have made up, right, constructed and defined in this psychiatric Bible, those are illnesses. And they become this reified kind of thing that we can easily identify through symptoms, and that we can easily treat through whatever modalities that we've come up with. Unwellness for me is much more capacious as a term because it is untethered from, I think, that kind of medical framework. Uh, Almost everybody will say they're feeling unwell at some point, right? Uh, like I feel unwell today, right? What does it mean when someone says that? And so I love that people use the term unwell in all different kinds of ways. It could mean like I have an upset stomach. It could mean I'm tired. It could mean like hard emotional shit happened in my family or in my relationship, right? And so because we already use that term so capaciously, I found it really helpful for gathering all sorts of experiences of pain and suffering under this kind of umbrella to then talk about care.
Yeah, this is Clayton speaking. Thank you to both of you for speaking to those different terms. And Mimi, I love what you were saying about how capacious unwell and unwellness is, because I think that's such a thought-provoking thing to consider, because there are terms that we often use in just conversations and pop culture and everything else that come with so much baggage. And the same is similar for like scholarship and academic work, is that there's so much baggage attached to a lot of terms. And I mean, you mentioning that makes me think back to some like intro to medical anthropology courses that I took
Mm.
that talk about, how when a person takes a sick day from work or something, they're also signaling that they're taking on this role of being quote unquote sick. And that often is attached to staying at home and being in bed and, all these other things. And then once you recover, you're no longer quote unquote sick. So you take on this different role as a person. And I think, using these more capacious terms of unwellness that can take different meanings for each person, but still conveys similar messages, can be really powerful, thinking about those roles and subject positions and the power in which people have to navigate those, which both of you talk about quite a bit in your books.
This is Margaret. One thing I love about Mimi's use of the term unwell is that it intervenes in the concept of wellness. And Mimi has been working with this term and developing it for many years. Like, I think in a lot of ways, Mimi, your work was prescient and anticipated what is now called the wellness industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
especially as it's sweeping across universities. One thing I really don't like about the term wellness, which is now just ubiquitous in university life, is that it has such a flattening effect. Wellness seems to be one thing that we're all kind of hoping to get to, but unwellness, uh, and I think here I'm largely echoing something Mimi just said. Typically, when you are unwell in some kind of way. You are unwell, and there's a story there. You are unwell, and it has to do with something. And that's one thing I love about the term unwellness is it seems to invite complication in story and response, whereas the term wellness, especially as it's been taken up by universities, implies a kind of bland, nobody needs to bother us because they're okay state of being.
This is Mimi. Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, wellness doesn't require a story because it's supposed to be the status quo. The
Right.
right,
Yeah. It's just this kind of hum, like,
right. We're and supposedly we all know what it is too. We all know what it's
yeah.
supposed to look like. And the university is there to help us, maintain it through
Yes.
deep breathing apps and things like that, right? And
Right.
so, and this binary is what I can't stand, right? Between unwellness and wellness, that we are inherently well and only sometimes get sick. And this gets at you, Clayton, talking about when you are sick, you become the sick person. And there is, when you take a sick day, right? Sick days imply that there are only some days that you get sick, and that the
Mm-hmm.
days that you're not taking the sick day, you are well,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when the days you take the sick days are the days you require care, which is,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, 10 days out of the year or something like that, right? And then that means that the other days you do not require any kind of care to maintain that wellness. And so then institutions, structures, communities, governments are totally off the hook for providing any kind of care because you're naturally well, right? You just get sick sometimes. This makes me also think of the binary you brought up, Margaret, of abled and disabled, right? When we have that binary that's so clear, um, that someone is clearly on one side or the other, then there is no kind of accountability actually to needs at all, right? Because apparently people who are able-bodied, able-minded, people who are well have no needs. You're not supposed to have any needs. And so nobody needs to create anything for you. Whereas the people who are unwell, ill, disabled, they have needs. And then we have to begrudgingly or actually not at all provide for those needs.
This is Clayton. I love that. And this conversation, I love where it's headed. And it makes me reflect a lot more on, as you mentioned, Margaret and also Mimi, just like the wellness industry and also how white wellness is and whiteness being attached
Yes.
to wellness as an ideal, but also the
Yes.
ways in which we're supposed to labor towards wellness. It makes me think of a book last year that I read called Disrupting White Mindfulness by Kathy May Carlsa. In that, it's a very incisive critique of the corporatization of mindfulness and like the Orientalism and the neoliberalism that has kind of wrapped its arms around mindfulness and divorcing it from the more like Asian and East Asian and South Asian practices, traditions, philosophies, and then turning it into this neoliberal just way to address any kind of quote unquote sickness or unwellness or anything else. And it makes me think of like how corporate it's become because I was first acquainted with mindfulness from therapy, different therapies that I've like used or been a part of. And one of the social workers slash therapists said in a group therapy session, she was like, 25% of the general population deals with some kind of mental illness. And she was like, the difference between all of y'all that are in here and the people out there are that you have difficulty coping with it and being productive with your even with your mental illness. And thinking through that really bothered me because it's like the main focus of the therapy sessions that we had was just like establish some boundaries, practice mindfulness and better coping skills, and then you can become a productive citizen again. You can become a productive worker. You can have, a better life in this capitalist system. And that was the main goal of everything that we were doing there. And it also adds to this collectivity and like collective work and accountability that you're talking about, because I'll also name drop because I don't have any shame. Like if you don't want to be mentioned, don't do it. But Starbucks, I worked for them for like 4 or 5 years, and now there's all these unionizing efforts and ways in which people are pushing back against some of Starbucks practices and how, baristas and different people are treated. But like when I was still there, the solution that they provided was, we'll cover the cost of a Headspace app for you for a year, which is like a mindfulness app that you can use. And they were like, this is how we care for you. We will give you access to a mindfulness app so that you can be in a better headspace when you start your shifts and provide better customer service. End rant.
This is Mimi speaking. Listeners can't see, but I've been like nodding vigorously through this whole through this conversation. Um, yeah, the wellness industrial complex. I fucking hate it. I hate the word wellness, um, because, like you're saying, the goal of wellness is to create a better worker, right? That is how we measure our supposed wellness and unwellness. Are you able to go to work or not?
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to do what you're supposed to do? And only when you fail to a certain degree at doing the things that you're supposed to do, right, then you're labeled as deviant in some way, right? Diagnosed with something or pathologized. So something we haven't mentioned or I haven't mentioned is the university, and both Margaret's book and my book focus on the university as a site of deep unwellness. They go together so well, Margaret. It's amazing how well they go
They
together
do.
in terms of looking at the university. Fuck the university. So I look a lot at students and their unwellness because, I've been doing mental health work for a while, for almost a decade now, and I've been traveling a lot and meeting students all over the country. And so at this point, I've met thousands of students and talked to them about what unwellness looks and feels like for them. And when you ask students what unwellness looks like, it is one, awful, the list that they describe about what their daily life experience is, but also, why does it look almost exactly the same at every university that I have visited, no matter the size of the university, no matter where geographically it's located? And then when you ask the universities what they think students need or what they think mental health is or wellness is, you get very different answers than what the students give. And it becomes very clear that what the university wants is students who can go to class and achieve at the highest levels that they expect. And that is being well. The problem with that, I mean, there's many problems with that, but one of the problems that becomes clear when you look at Asian Americans is that Asian Americans are actually able to function in educational systems at high levels while being in extreme distress. And because that is part of what it means to be a model minority in the US, that is part of what we have been taught that it takes to survive and to be included, right? A conditional belonging in the US. And so we have lots of Asian American students walking around getting straight A's, and then suddenly something is very clearly wrong, right? So this is a content warning, and I'll mention some things about suicide and suicidal ideation. Asian Americans have some of the highest rates of suicidal ideation in college, and often with no precursor, right? That people can see that they are in distress, because the ways that the mental health industry measures unwellness is, are you going to class? Are you able to meet your obligations? And so when you can meet your obligations, then, oh, you're well, until you decide that you want to take your own life.
This is Margaret. That's so important, Mimi, to recognize what that experience is like in the academic industry, and it is an industry. One of the things that happened when I was working on the chapter in Crip Spacetime that talks about cost as a theme sort of the cost to body minds, the ways that cost is used to rationalize harm, assuming that wellness is exists for the purpose of being productive, all those dimensions. One thing I started getting curious about was how is cost imagined? How are cost and disability and failure imagined in other industries? I've been a professor for a long time. My spouse, Jana, is an architect. So I had gotten a little look at how the business world treats the notion of wellness and injury. And, in a lot of ways, it's not so different from academe. There's sort of a single accommodation model. But one of the things I noticed, because Jana is an architect, is that there's an attitude toward buildings and objects that assumes unwellness and failure as part of the process. And I went down this kind of rabbit hole trying to explore different building terms like metal fatigue or 5-hour wall. A 5-hour wall is a wall that is supposed to last for 5 hours in case of some unusual disaster event. And I won't name the disaster events because people don't need possible personal experiences being named, but basically a 5-hour wall or a 3-hour wall signals this is how long this will hold up if X happens. Area of refuge is another common building term. So I just got really interested in the building industry as a whole and how it assumes failure is part of the process. And I was thinking along and thinking, what is that good? Like the building industry only acknowledges failure when it comes to objects. Like it doesn't assume that it's human workers should be subject to failure of any kind. And then because I'm also a sports fan, I started thinking about the disabled list. In certain sports, including baseball, teams routinely carry what used to be called a disabled list. That's just a list of people on the team who are not functional enough to play at any given time. And there are these clear structures around the disabled list. Like you can only have a certain number of people on it, and a person can only be on the list for a certain amount of time. And I was toying with this in my mind as well, thinking, what would it mean in the academic industry if we just assumed people would be disabled for a certain amount of time per year, that we would automatically be covering for each other, that we would automatically have substitutes for every position instead of assuming that every single job has only one person in it. But then again, my thinking sort of turned grimmer, and I was thinking, well, in professional athletics, particularly, human body minds are being treated as interchangeable, basically. Like the reason the disabled list exists is so that people can be worn out and replaced. And then right in the middle of all this thinking, the Major League Baseball changed the name of the disabled list to the injured list. So I don't know the reasons for that change, but I think the term disabled was deemed to be too permanent, just as we were talking about earlier. And they thought we should just call people injured, not disabled, because that signals the temporary nature of what we're trying to pretend is happening to everyone. And sorry, that was kind of a digression of the cost issue that I got very excited about. But another thing I wanted to mention, if I'm able to share my screen, I'll just describe the image. The concepts of accountability and collectivity, which are, I think, so important to Mimi's book and also became one of the findings of Crip Spacetime, are being actively co-opted by academia. So one thing that I've noticed in academia is that the phrase culture of access or culture of care is popping up more and more on university websites, especially in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
So gross.
I know.
So
Yeah, I mean,
gross.
I guess I'm almost glad I can't share this image right now, but I'll describe it. On a university website that I was browsing the term culture of care, And this university apparently had a single day, an awareness day, as universities love to do, around the idea of culture of care. They gave out T-shirts that said culture of care on the front. And the students in the picture, who are sort of carefully multiracial and, optically diverse, are holding a bunch of very colorful balloons and smiling and laughing and wearing these T-shirts that say
Wow.
culture of care. And I mean, it's really something that verges on self-parody. But I see it cropping up more and more in public-facing academic documents.
This is me. I'm stunned right now. I've become aware of the prevalence of wellness um, at universities as I've been traveling around and talking with students. But culture of access was not something that I had been aware is popping up because that feels like, I mean, it's such a dirty co-optation, right? It's culture of access is that's what we do, right? That's what we want to do. That's what disability justice is about. It's about creating spaces that don't just accommodate, individual differences sometimes, but actually try to work towards, access for everybody in relational and negotiated ways. Um, so yeah, the idea that university using that is just this. It is not surprising, but shocking still.
Yeah.
One of my pet peeves, I have ranted about this in other spaces, but universities have discovered the term justice and the phrase disability justice, and these crop up everywhere in locations that have nothing to do with an actual community based movement centering queer and disabled people of color. Like you'll have a group of all white people all securely employed in academia being like, this is disability justice. And I'm like, nah, it's not, no, don't check that.
This is Clayton. Yeah, I totally get that and appreciate y'all bringing this up specifically to talk about the image that you brought up, Margaret. I find it so interesting because I went to Kansas State University, and it's in very like small town, rural Kansas, and not known as the most diverse, inclusive, accessible, equitable place. Like even using those buzzwords, it's not great at applying those standards. But I mean, thinking about, how inaccessible much of the campus was because most of it was built in like 1900s. And like even bathrooms, not even gender neutral bathrooms anywhere. And in a lot of these old university buildings, bathrooms are divided by gender, and the women's bathrooms on the first floor, the men's bathrooms on the second floor. And then there's that alternating access to the gendered bathrooms, which of course is an accessibility issue. And then there's the added violence of like anti-queer and anti-trans like rhetoric and behaviors that are often go with more conservative places like that. But anyway, to go to the image, I had a coworker when I was at Starbucks who was a soccer player for K-State, and she would laugh about it. She was like stereotypical Barbie, and she was a soccer player, long blonde hair, everything else, but she had injured her knee during one season, so she used crutches, and they had like a diversity day for, or not, they didn't call it diversity day, but basically a diversity day for the
Oh
campus. And
no.
yeah, and they had her sit in a wheelchair to go
Oh
around and do this
no.
like walk around campus, being pushed by like the star coach of the football team. And like all these pictures generated from that image of, her
Wow.
being this temporarily disabled person, but it didn't look like that from the image. It was like, oh, anyone with a disability is welcomed and centered on this campus and everything else. And it's like knowing the story behind that image, it's like that's not even the case. It was this star soccer player who had a temporary injury, but it provided a great photo op.
But Clayton, don't you feel cared for and included? in that process.
Of course. How could I not? Yeah, I'd love to invite both of you kind of if we could talk a little bit more about this academic space that both of your books are centered on, because we've discussed it a little. And Margaret, your book focuses on disabled academics, people that are adjunct professors, tenured professors, scholars, instructors, those different subject positions. And then Mimi, yours focuses a lot on students, but also some of your experiences as an adjunct professor and others, specifically an Asian American adjunct professor and other adjunct professors. So I'd love to kind of open this conversation to talk about, this topic of unwellness and disability and Crip Spacetime and the various subject positions involved in academia and the various ways that different people have access to power in different ways and how that shapes experiences of people based on ability or disability and race and ethnicity and those other sites of experience. So I don't know if either of you have a preference for going first, but I would just love, opening opportunity to have this conversation.
I don't have a preference, but I'm happy to go in either order. How are you feeling, Mimi?
You go ahead, Margaret.
Okay. Most of the people that were interviewees on the disabled academic study are multiply minoritized. So when my colleague Stephanie Kirschbaum and I set out to begin this interview study, Stephanie and I ended up writing different books. Like we went in different directions theoretically, but we did most of the interviewing together. We decided that we were not going to attempt to gather a representative sample. A representative sample, as the name suggests, gives you kind of a statistical snapshot of a certain population. And it's meant to be like a sort of boiled down version of a certain population. Like this represents the experiences of the larger population. And for various reasons, partly just that our study was almost wholly unfunded. Like we figured we have no way of even attempting that. And what we tried to do instead, which was more our interest as scholars of disability studies and rhetoric, was we used a method that's informally called diversity sampling. It's sometimes called maximum variation sampling, where you deliberately go out and try to work with participants who are as different from each other as possible. And the idea is to get as wide a range of experiences, as different a range of stories as you can, so that you can learn the kinds of things that previously had not even been guessed at. And that way, people who learn from the study, it has various uses, but one of the uses it has from a research point of view is people can ask better questions. If you're not always studying the so-called representative or typical person, you can ask better questions for future research that don't just always assume, sort of a narrower stripe of normative people having some kind of experience. And one thing that I learned doing these interviews is that when a person is in a multiply minoritized position, for example, they are a Black deaf woman who is teaching at a college. This is not a shocking finding, but it was certainly held true throughout the disabled academic studies. The experiences of just the complexity and the oppressions and the microaggressions that are encountered every day, they're not just multiplied, they are exponentially increased. And there's always a certain amount of guesswork involved in living in some kind of minoritized position. Like, did that person treat me crappy because of X, or are they just having a bad day? You sort of have this constant guesswork tape and awareness of your own potential vulnerability going. Again, that experience when a participant is multiply minoritized was just exponential. So, for example, one faculty member whose pseudonym is Jackie, came into a new academic job, and Jackie is blind and identified. I asked all the participants to identify themselves, and she identifies as a blind woman of color. And she went through an incredibly painful experience of just trying to get some very basic accommodations. For example, a scanner so that she could scan the books that she needed to read, and a human reader, a person to read aloud material that couldn't be scanned in a timely manner. It took more than a year to put these apparently simple accommodations in place. And as Jackie was going through this process, all these very gendered, racialized, ableist terms were used about her concerns, like I'm trying to think of exactly what term was used. Like, she's never satisfied. She wants so much. She's asking for more teaching releases. She doesn't want to teach. Um, and the person who was relaying this communication to Jackie said they're getting really nasty. Like that, we have to push back on the same kind of level because these criticisms, which by the way, were coming from deans, they were coming from upper administrators at Jackie's school, were building this narrative of Jackie as the constantly complaining, mean, angry, arguing, disabled woman of color. So that was one thing that was identified many, many times by participants, was that they would find themselves sort of thrust into these narratives about how like difficult or argumentative or in whatever way, like not meeting the quote unquote good minority narrative that they were supposed to be fitting. And then another thing that was quite often reported, unsurprisingly, was that universities would use disabled faculty of color for sort of as window dressing. So just as we were just talking about a minute ago, a Black faculty member who is deaf and working with an interpreter um, was asked to place herself in a very visible position at an event at her university. The event was for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and it just does not seem like a surprise that while this faculty member had originally been working sort of at a visually unobtrusive table with her interpreter, the organizer of the event, who was a white woman, bustled over and said, "Oh, can you get up on the stage? Can you get closer to the stage?" And this participant said, it was pretty obvious that they wanted me working with my interpreter to be highly visible. Like, oh, look at everything that we're doing for this person. It's, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Here's our Black female faculty member who's also deaf and working with an interpreter. Be sure we get a picture of that. That same issue of trying to emphasize optics and appearance over a substantive or relational response to disability. I mean, the obvious first question should have been, where do you want to sit? Like, where would it make the most sense for you to work with your interpreter? That was completely disregarded.
Mhm.
Thank you for that, Margaret. This is Mimi speaking. Um, yeah, I appreciated your attention in your book to positionality of the folks that you talked to in relation to not only identity markers, but the university itself, right? Because, like you mentioned, Clayton, my work looks specifically at the experiences of adjuncts or contingent faculty, in part because I've been an adjunct. I've been an adjunct for over 10 years now. And I've been an adjunct intentionally, which is not how most people do adjuncting. Most people are forced to do adjuncting because there are not enough tenure track jobs and there are way too many PhDs. And because programs want to offer more courses, and it's much easier and cheaper to hire contract laborers for it. Universities want to offer more things. They want to be able to tout how much they're able to offer to their students. Uh, and adjuncts are an endless supply of disposable, cheap labor to accomplish that. And that became clear to me as I was adjuncting. I chose to be an adjunct because I wasn't interested in the tenure track. And as you mentioned, that my book is both academic and not academic, because I was trying to do academia on my own terms, right? How do I do the work that I want to do that doesn't fit the mold of what tenured research one professors are supposed to be doing? How do I engage scholarship, do intellectual inquiry, but also do arts work, also do community work? And so I sort of kept one foot in, one foot out. And the way I was doing that in part was by teaching. So being attached to a university, working with students, and doing student-centered teaching, but not taking a tenure track position. So fast forward though, that adjuncting sucks, I learned, because you get paid shit and you don't get, benefits and you don't get stability or security. But most people know that sort of about adjunct working conditions. What I didn't know until I had been an adjunct for years and it became clear is that the relationship between adjunct faculty and tenured faculty is also fucked because it is a two-tiered system, right? Two-tiered class system that exists in the university and in our departments. So some of us get benefits and security, and some of us don't. The ones of us who do get the benefits and security actually rely upon the ones that don't so that they can get their security. And that kind of relationship, structural relationship, I started seeing as one of unwellness, one of that ableism too. And so the way that I've developed my thinking around that, actually I'll just share briefly. It's because I was an adjunct at University of Maryland in Asian American Studies, fuck Maryland. And I was pushed out, right? I was pushed out by tenured colleagues. And that's when the kind of disposability and precarity of adjuncts became very, very clear to me, even though I'd been in the program for years and had worked, with students for years and had been friends with all the tenured faculty. We're a family, right? Especially in an ethnic studies program, in an Asian American studies program that feels minoritized in the university, right? That's always trying to defend itself against the university that's trying to get rid of it. That only exists because students demand for it, right? Uh, it's embattled, and so we're like this, tight family fighting the university and trying to provide for our students and doing the good work. Until I realized that, oh, this family is fucked, and it's fucked because of structural divide actually that exists and has to exist for the department to function, right? Because the department is not allowed to hire any more tenure track faculty. So let's hire a bunch of adjuncts to teach all of our classes for us while we get our tenure and write our books and get our promotions. But we're a family. And so when I got pushed out of Maryland, um, first I cried a bunch, but then after that, I started thinking about what does that mean for the university. And so part of my book, like you said, looks at adjunctification uh, and looks at the relationship between adjuncts and tenured faculty. And what binds them together is what I've identified as a system of meritocracy. So we all believe that the university is meritocratic, right? That you earn your degree through hard work, you achieve because you worked hard, you're smart, uh, you get jobs because you've worked hard and you're smart, right? You move up in your career because you've worked hard and you're smart. And those who don't, who haven't, who somehow fail, it's just because they didn't work hard enough or they're not smart enough or they're not cut out for it. And I realized that we all actually have a very deep investment in understanding the university that way. And that is directly tied to ideas of wellness as well, right? You are the productive academic worker and you're well, and then that means that you get to achieve, right? You get to be successful. It's the ones who aren't well, who aren't enough, who don't do the right things, the ones who are deviant or distant from that normative ideal. Of course, they're failing. They don't fit in anyway. So, I look at those relationships and I don't think people have really looked at adjunctification from that lens before. And I have found that a lens of unwellness and structural unwellness, right? Not individualized unwellness, but looking at the way that structures are disabling, right? Structures are enabling and disabling, um, has really helped to highlight the ways the university uh, bears down upon different parts, different people in different structural positions. Ooh, that was a lot. I hope that made sense.
Yeah,
This
definitely
is
snaps for
Margaret.
that.
Yes, it not only made sense, it's so important. And I'm also nodding and waving my hands and getting very excited over here. Uh, if it's okay, I want to just amplify one of the things Mimi was just mentioning, from my own standpoint as a tenured professor at a research university, um, which is I was shocked when I came here 8 years ago. This was my first job at a research university where I was on the tenure track as opposed to an adjunct. I had adjuncted before at the University of Michigan and at Wayne State University. Um, so I came here as already tenured at Ohio State, and I was shocked at how straightforwardly in faculty meetings people would talk about the need for exploitation, with the justification being the wellness of the department or the wellness of the college or the wellness of the
Mm.
university itself. And in this way, I have been noticing the so-called decline of the humanities. I mean, I have some different thoughts about whether the humanities are actually in decline, and how we're defining humanities, and for that matter, how we're defining decline. But there's this very well-known story that the humanities are in dramatic decline right now. And that is often used, it's called a crisis, and then that so-called crisis is used as justification for further exploitation. For example, we can't lower the course cap on that class is being taught by graduate students, just handing them a gigantic amount of labor every semester that, by the way, other grad students aren't doing, because it's for the wellness of the department. We have to have X number of contingent faculty because it's for the good of the department. And then sort of the extrapolation is, which in turn is good for the university, which in turn is good for the humanities as a whole, apparently. And I came here from Spelman College, which is a very small HBCU for women. And I mean, Spelman is not like heaven. Like, Spelman doesn't do everything perfectly, but there was a really strong culture of respect among everyone who worked as an instructor and as a staff member. And there was a lot of variance. Again, it wasn't like a perfect utopia, but just the assumption that we should be trying not to exploit each other was abruptly absent when I arrived at a research
Mm.
university. And among the many shocks of coming to a huge, predominantly white R1 institution was the shock of realizing that now I am really part of the machine. And the strategies of resistance that I need to think about have to be happening in a different way and on a different scale.
Thank you for talking about the wellness of the department and the wellness of the university as a discourse. It's awful, but it's also brilliant the way you're talking about it. I've looked at wellness in many constructions, and I hadn't thought about that the exploitation I know upholds the workings of the university, and the justifications are often the things you're saying, right? Like we need more students, we need to offer these things. Sometimes the justification actually is it's for the wellness of the adjunct as well, which is wild to me. Is because it's giving a PhD opportunity, right, to teach, or it's because it's literally to help them pay the bills, which actually is helpful, right? Because they don't have any jobs. Um, but yeah, thank you for naming that as a form of like deploying wellness to enact unwellness.
Yeah, this is Clayton. I really appreciate that and kind of thinking of that with some of your work in the chapter, The Professor is Ill, Mimi. It really stood out to me how you were talking about a lot of the structural experiences and also the design of the structure of adjuncting and contingent faculty, and how, these kinds of ways that are institutionalized just normalize the power imbalances and the hierarchies and the privileges of certain people. So I just really appreciate that, and how it specifically names like these academic structures are that way for a reason, and they like
Hmm.
normalize and invisibilize the ways in which they exploit people and contribute to the unwellness that in a lot of ways is difficult for academics to actually claim. And you talk quite a bit about this in your book, Margaret, of how tenuous of a position it is to claim disability, or maybe in your terms claim unwellness, because it can compromise what people think you can do as an academic, and it can make them think about you in certain ways and treat you in different ways. So that's something that I just wanted to call out, because it was a very poignant piece and like argument, the ways that your books kind of complemented each other in this conversation, and highlighted that. Because Margaret, in Crip Spacetime, you use Crip Spacetime, as we mentioned in the New Books Network interview. Like, it's not just a person with a disability has a different perspective. They're living pretty much in a different reality and experiencing things in different ways. And that's true in these structural cases too, of adjuncting and the imbalances that academia creates. So, being mindful of time, I did want to just give either or both of you the floor. If there's anything that we haven't talked about that you would love to specifically mention in our last couple minutes.
This is Mimi speaking. I do. Um I love the way that you just tied our books together, Clayton. That was
I
wonderful.
know.
Like, hey, okay, you know what the books are about. You could do this all by yourself.
This is a lot more fun though.
What you mentioned though made me think about the penalties, right? That's part of the costs, right? That Margaret talks about, the penalties of um what I call claiming unwellness, right? And there you are punished for being unwell or for not meeting expectations. And so it's very scary to be vulnerable and admit that you need things or that you don't meet the expectations. And I call that compulsory wellness, right? The pressure to perform that you are well all the time. And so my work, and I think Margaret's work does this too in its work of witness, shows what happens when you are given permission to admit that you're unwell and that you need things. So much of my book is, and my work when I work with people in workshops and talks, is trying to create those kinds of spaces of vulnerability, of trust, and of permission granted to admit that we all need things and we can need those things together. And it's actually much safer when you're able to need things together and then build things together than doing it individually, because individually you'll be individually punished for it. And so I hope that people get from both of our books not only how awful and hard it is to be struggling with unwellness, but also what we gain when we look at it directly and when we do it together and when we give ourselves and others permission to do that work together.
It's really important to me to keep in mind that academic space, any space that brings people together, I think has the potential to be a revolutionary space. One of the big findings of Crip Spacetime was attempting to handle disability individually so we can fix people and make them more productive is definitely that is a course that is going poorly. We need to move toward and this very much echoes Mimi's book as well, collectivity, accountability. And that once I arrived at that conclusion, I realized I have no idea what this would look like or how one might try to effect it. So the conclusion of Crip Spacetime talks about the notion of gathering. what it means to gather, what it means to come together, especially when everyone's sick and disabled, especially when everyone is just stretched to their last nerve and has childcare responsibilities and is separated in space and time. Um, and so my new project that is, just I'm really just barely starting to think about it, is about the radical potential of gathering, thinking about what we can mean by gathering, and noticing the spaces where folks are already gathering, are already engaging in acts of collective access and building cultures of care, um, in academia, in community, and especially in the spaces that go between academia and other areas. How is gathering and collective access already taking place, and what can we learn from that? That's where I'm trying to go next.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think a perfect way to wrap up our conversation, even though I really don't even want
Yeah.
it to end. But thank you both so much for joining me today for this conversation and being able to talk about both of your amazing books. I'm super excited to see people pick up these books and be able to read them, and also the changes and ripples that it's going to make in not just disability studies or Asian American studies, but how, all these different fields collide in academia and in people's everyday lives.
Thank you so much, Clayton.
Yes, agreed. Thank you so much. And it's really just such a joy to see you and talk to both of you.
Margaret, I love being in community with you at all times. So this is such a lovely opportunity to think together, and as a form of gathering as well, right?
Agree. Yeah, what a treat. Thank you.